so much for having me here.
Maybe.
Yep, I think I'm all set. Well, thank you so much for having me here today. It's really an honor to come and present to this audience. And in many ways, this is a special treat for me. This is something I'm quite excited about. I'm on mute? I'm on mute?
No, but let's check again.
Okay.
No, you're not. Maybe
Hello?
closer.
Closer? Is that better?
Can you hear?
Is that any better? There you go. Great. Well, as I was saying, it's a real pleasure for me to be here. So much of the time when I'm talking about biometrics, I'm talking with people that don't know much about biometrics. And so this is a very different audience than the kinds of audiences that I usually get to speak to. So thank you for inviting me. And I have a few things to talk about today, especially the title of the presentation is about internet scale adoption of biometrics. And part of what I wanted to speak to today was to talk about this very exciting time that we're living in, because biometrics, if you go back several years, biometrics have been on the verge of happening for quite some time. We've seen some laptops. I see a couple of ThinkPads in the audience. Laptops have had some fingerprint sensors for a while, but they never really got adopted at any significant scale, nor were they used. But over the last couple of years, we've seen an explosion of fingerprint sensors going into mobile devices. And so we're really starting to see the beginning of this era of biometrics being part of our daily experience, part of how we unlock our devices, part of how we access all of our information online. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that, both how we got here and then looking forward into the future, how some of these trends are likely to continue. So with that, great. So the way I think of it, there's really three major eras in this adoption of biometrics at scale. Right? So to be very clear, this is about consumer use of biometrics on our everyday devices. This is very different than, say, for example, the fingerprint scanners or the iris scanners that you might see at an airport, border control, things of that nature. This is really consumer everyday use of biometrics. And there's really three major eras that are starting to become very clear. And right now, we're really kind of in between this first and second era, where we've just started to see adoption of fingerprint sensors at scale in a certain type of device, in this case, mobile devices. And really just for a specific use case, which is device unlock. And we'll talk more about this. Well, it's unlock in general, but primarily device unlock. But as we'll go through the presentation, we'll talk about the second era, which is use case expansion. How do you take this platform? How is it being adapted and being used for other purposes other than this initial unlock use case? And then how does that expand out into other device categories and other use cases? And if there were a curve here of usage and ubiquity, over time, this becomes higher and higher and higher. Already, we started to see, just in this first wave alone, in this first era, people starting to say, well, I'm not going to buy this mobile device if it doesn't have a biometric capability on it. It's just become too convenient, too useful in our daily lives. And that trend will just continue on into the future, defined by these major eras. But if we talk a little bit about how did we get here, because you can't understand the future without understanding the past. It's hard to understand how the industry will evolve if you don't spend some time thinking about how we got to where we are today. And really, this is a pattern that you see, especially in the security space, especially in the biometric space, which is how do you find this magic formula for driving the initial adoption of a new piece of technology? Security, biometry, a handful of technologies all fit this characteristic. And it's a trade-off, right, between convenience, security, and risk. And depending upon how you choose to balance that, how you balance those trade-offs, what you choose to emphasize, you wind up with different solutions. And it's important to understand here, what I mean by risk, for instance. Risk is, there's an absolute sense of risk. How much risk is involved? What are you protecting? What's the risk if that information is lost or compromised? But there's also another dimension of risk, which is very important, which is how much do you actually gain in improvement? if you can put a sensor on something, but if it isn't used in a meaningful way, are you really getting a significant benefit from it? And it doesn't matter what the biometric type here is, and even though I'm with a fingerprint company, I try to generalize these in as many ways as possible. And it's this balance and this trade-off. It can be convenient, but if it doesn't mitigate risk in any meaningful way, it won't get used, and so on. So, like I said, I saw a couple of people with ThinkPads here. You may or may not have fingerprint sensors on your phones, but having spent a few years now working on the mass adoption of fingerprint sensors, especially in mobile devices, we spent a fair amount of time looking at, well, what happened with PCs? Because fingerprint sensors have been on PCs for quite some time, but they weren't very popular. Well, why weren't they popular? Why didn't they get used? What was the problem? Was it a problem with the sensor? Was it a problem with something else? And it boils down to this, an imbalance here in these three key dimensions. The fingerprint sensors were swipe sensors on PCs. They didn't work as well as touch sensors. They're more subject to rotation. They weren't used as frequently during the day. So if you think about how many times a day would you actually use it, somewhere between 2 and maybe 8, depending upon how often you get up and leave your PC during the day. And even though, yes, putting a fingerprint sensor on a PC was interesting and useful, you could unlock your PC, the challenge is that you weren't actually changing the risk profile that much, because these PCs that we use are well set up for fast entry of name and password. So if you didn't have a fingerprint sensor there, you weren't really seeing much of a risk mitigation. It wasn't like people were suddenly, logging into their PCs more frequently because you had a fingerprint sensor in there. So while it was an interesting experiment and there were a lot of lessons learned, there wasn't enough value being delivered with a fingerprint sensor on these PCs to drive adoption. And I think there's another issue too. A variety of reasons for this, but the focus initially was on enterprise use cases, and so it was also secondarily very difficult for IT to hook up those sensors into the back end of corporate enterprises. So many machines were shipped with fingerprint sensors, but you couldn't actually use them to log on to your corporate network. And there was no compelling reason for consumers to use them if they happened to have them on a device that they bought. So it was this interesting piece of hardware. But even today, while we use fingerprint sensors on so many of our phones, fingerprint sensor use on laptops, not very popular today. Partly because of modality, the swipe sensor, and these other issues. Now, so if that was a learning lesson, if you will, kind of leading into this, what's now the first era of internet scale consumer biometrics, this was where we've got the formula right. And in many ways, we have to look to some of the industry leaders. Apple did an awful lot to demonstrate a solution that was high value. But there is one key difference between these PC devices and these devices, which is you take these out of your pocket and you log into them more than 10 times a day. Many people more than 20, more than 30. And so there were real issues around risk, right? So, it was so annoying to put your name and password here to unlock your device or even to use a PIN that you just wouldn't do it. So you had these completely unlocked devices floating around out there, whether they had corporate assets or personal assets, your personal photos. There was a fair amount of risk involved. It was just too annoying to put in even just a 4-digit PIN. It was too annoying every single time to do it. So you had a point of pain. You had a point of pain, you had a point of friction that was really addressed by the convenience factor of fingerprint sensors. So now this is how all of these pieces come together. You're using the device a lot. You save an enormous amount of time. You cut out a lot of friction from the authentication experience. That led to widespread adoption, as we see on these mobile devices. And it's actually kind of interesting. This is a diagram that we put together to just show the adoption curve of some critical other mobile device technology, GSM camera, 3G, and you can see that fingerprint sensors are just tracking that curve directly. Very interesting diagram. When I first saw this, I was like, oh yes, that makes total sense. That explains, at least from from an adoption perspective, what we've been experiencing subjectively. And it'll continue on. And it could be fingerprint sensors, it could be another modality of biometry. Certainly when you get into low-cost devices, very low-cost devices, you have different cost issues there, and it may be different types of biometry. But one thing that's really important, if you think back to this first era, and where are we at right now, and what are we heading into, and what are the major changes ahead? This major adoption that we've seen of biometry on mobile devices has been driven by really a single use case. That's just device unlock. And it's been very powerful, but that's really all of these sensors do for the vast bulk of the time that they're in use. Unlock, first for the device, and slowly we're starting to see unlock on an application level, so that before you log into your bank, for instance, you can use the biometry. But that's a very different use than what we're going to see, what we're starting to see with some of the payment solutions and other things that are coming. But this is really, as I see it, this is kind of the end of the first era. It's continuing, it's vibrant, it's growing, but if you try to characterize the difference between this and the next set of things coming, this was the use case that drove adoption. Every new technology needs a major driver. This was the driver in this case. But now, in order to sustain the momentum, to get biometry in use in every aspect of our life, we have to go on and do more. So this is use case expansion now. This is taking the fact that we've built this massive infrastructure now, whether it's an Apple device, a Samsung device, a Lenovo device, a Huawei device, doesn't matter. Now you've got millions, hundreds of millions of devices out there that have built-in biometry. So now you can start to build services on top of them. In the early days, I remember I was very involved in some of the early Samsung devices. It was a real challenge to drive adoption of those sensors on those devices because it was too small of an audience. Not enough of them were out in the field. Even the early iPhones, as popular as iPhones are, banks were very reluctant to start to use that technology because there just wasn't enough of an install base. But these sensors have been in the market on devices now long enough with enough units that it really is an install base, and it's a platform off of which other use cases can attach and get some of that benefit of biometry. Because again, we're talking about friction reduction. We're talking about the same ease of unlock that you get with your phone to do payment. But the payment systems that use biometry are still launching very slowly. A lot of people thought that Apple Pay, for instance, would launch and it would just take over the world very, very quickly. And while there are infrastructure reasons why that hasn't happened, we're going to talk about a few of the other challenges because there are gaps between the solution that works for device unlock or unlock of any sort and the sorts of things that you need if you're going to go into these other use cases. Now, these are just two use cases of many. One is payment, there's transit. I could come up with 15 other different use cases, still within the Android device sector. This isn't even going on to talk about other devices, Internet of Things devices, the kinds of uses that we'll see soon in cars and in the thermostats in our houses. So this is kind of the core challenge that we have to work through in what I call the second era here, which is there's a fundamental difference between what's happening when you're using any method of biometry for device unlock. And that is, it's the fingerprint or the iris or the whatever, the voice print. Is that method of biometry, is that actually authorized for use to unlock the device or the app or what have you? And that's a pretty straightforward question, right? That's a simple technological question. I've got a template, I've got a scan, do they match? And do I have a high enough confidence level in that match? It's fairly straightforward. But as you'll see, that's not actually what the service is. And it could be payment, it could be transit, it could be national ID, it could be any number of things. Is the account owner authorizing the transaction? Is the user really who they say they are? And are they authorizing this activity using the fingerprint sensor as a proxy or the iris as a proxy for that? And these are very, very different questions. And there's been a lot of heartache within the financial sector around using biometrics because Just to give you a little example, I bought my 13-year-old a phone, her first phone with a fingerprint sensor on it. The very first thing I did was enroll my finger on that phone before I gave it to her so I could always unlock it. You know, simple and straightforward. My wife has a fingerprint enrolled on my phones so that if she needs to pick it up and use it, she can. Well, if she goes and purchases, who made the purchase? If she uses my account in my app on my device, the fingerprint sensor system says, yes, I know this finger. But the bank, the financial service, Amazon, Yahoo, whatever, it doesn't know. There's actually a term for this in the industry called friendly fraud. And this is a challenge that we have to overcome. I'll talk a little bit more about this. But more fundamentally, this is an example of a key difference between a first era, or if you will, Biometrics 1.0 to Biometrics 2.0, which is high trust. Biometrics 1.0 was just, is there a match? I've got a scan, I've got a template, is there a match? Very useful. You know, look at how many of our devices, probably most of you have a phone with a fingerprint sensor built in at this point. But the next wave really will be high trust. Greater confidence that it's not just a template match, but that you are actually you. And let's talk about this a little bit more. So what goes into this and how you get that confidence is quite a bit different. It's not just a template match. You have to understand more about the modern identity stack that lives, you know, at the back end, in many cases, of the systems and services that we use online. So there's many pieces to it, and I could spend an hour just talking about the differences between, you know, what is just authentication and the full identity stack. But fundamentally, what we're talking about is tying the biometric and the individual biometric, the template for this finger and this finger, but not your finger, to notions of identity, user management, everything on the back end that's needed to make a modern infrastructure work, like the infrastructures that you see at Google and Amazon and Apple and all of the other major back-end systems. Now, keep in mind, these devices and this biometry was really invented for, you know, just for, and in phase one or era one is device unlock. But this is a very big transition. And there's a gap, there's a technical gap here between the models that are in place today for device unlock and all of these use cases that are coming, all of which have, I think, are best characterized by requiring higher trust in the authentication event and that the user is actually who they represent themselves to be, that template has been matched to some identity in the back end. Today, at best, it's a loose coupling. It's not a fixed and firm coupling. So there's plenty that we could talk about here. I'd say the solutions here are in the works. There's a reason why, when I put a timeline on that first slide, I indicated that there's a fair amount of work to be done and a few years to go in this second phase, because we're really starting to understand now, as an industry, what are the challenges, what are the potential solutions, and how do we solve them? It's a mix of tying into back-end systems. It's a mix of potentially some standards like those put out by the FIDO Alliance and a few other standards bodies. But there's also interesting policy and personal privacy discussions in the mix that are part of how we solve this. You know, today biometrics are stored on my device, which is a pretty good place for them to be. It's been instrumental in driving adoption. But if you want to connect me to my national ID or to my bank account, at what point will there be privacy considerations? Whether or not you keep the biometric on the device or whether you share it. These are very interesting and sensitive policy questions that come up as well. So there are certainly technical answers. The technical answers to this are actually pretty easy to solve. The issues become one of risk, policy, what liability is held by the device manufacturer. You know, they're fine with fingerprint sensors being used to unlock devices, But it's a very different question if now you're starting to, look to this device to provide, a strong guarantee of individual identity. That's a different risk proposition than when it's just on the device for unlock. So there's some real tension, that perhaps on the research side you don't see all the time, but there's a lot of tension below the surface in how these things are going to work together and what the ultimate solutions will look like. And if you're interested, I can talk more about that a little bit later. So the third era is really about platform expansion. And this is one that to me is really exciting because we're, even though we're kind of moving in a very stepwise, a stepwise, logical, straightforward fashion through all of the deployment issues around the second era. We can see this third era is on the horizon. We can see all of these devices that we use on a daily basis, whether it's our thermostat, whether it's the front door to our house, whether it's our car. We can see that these biometrics that have become so popular and so useful on these mobile devices are going to be part of the experiences of the cars, of the houses that we have before too long in the future. And we've seen now that there's a very clear validation of one modality of authentication, biometric authentication, and one device category. And we're seeing an explosion of different devices where, oh my gosh, I want a biometric, whether it's an iris or a fingerprint sensor or voice or whatever, I want it on that. I got an Amazon Echo when they first shipped in the United States, and if you're not familiar with it, it's not a biometric authentication device, but it's a fantastic voice recognition device for controlling your home. It's amazing in terms of kind of taking a piece of the future and dropping it right into your house. My kids and my wife, who they can't drive the media system and figure out how to get music to play any other way in the house. They can just walk up to it and say, Alexa, play whatever they want. And they just tell it and it works. So you're seeing these little slices, whether we're in industry and academia, you see where this future is going to go. But what we don't know yet is which modality is going to work best for which kind of device and platform. And it took an awfully long time for us to solve this question of what is the minimum feature set, the minimum capability to get at scale deployment on mobile devices. So how do we do the same thing on cars? Just as a for instance. What will that look like? There are environmental issues. There are physical safety issues. There's liability issues. Do you want the fingerprint sensor on the car door? Do you want it on the steering wheel? Do you want it in the dash? Do you not even want to have a touch interface? Do you want to be able to just have it recognize your eyes when you sit in the car? There's a lot of experimentation that we have the benefit on the mobile side of being able to look back to what worked and what didn't work with desktops. But now we're in new and uncharted territory, and it's super exciting. There's going to be a lot of innovation in this space. But we really don't know the answers yet. We've got guesses. If you talk to someone from an iris company, they're like, yes, iris is the way to go for all car applications. Talk to a voice company, yes, voice control, voice auth, perfect for cars. Fingerprint sensor companies, yes, put fingerprint sensors everywhere. Put them in the gear shift, put them in the dash. Put 3 fingerprint sensors on the car. We're happy to sell you 3 fingerprint sensors. But the answer really is nobody knows. All we know is that there's going to be a pervasive use of biometrics in all of the devices that we use. And that's part of what's interesting. On the academic side, I think it's got to be a really interesting time to be looking at all of these use cases and scenarios and modalities and bringing them together. There's just an awful lot of innovation that's ahead. It's just a visual way of saying of visually illustrating what I was just saying. We don't know the answers. We really don't know. But it's going to be a multi-year discovery process. There will be experiments. There'll be cars with fingerprint sensors. There'll be cars where you can unlock your car with your phone that has a fingerprint sensor. There'll be cars that use iris. There's many, many different types of innovation coming. And this is going to be an exciting space for all of us in the years to come. I saw a mention in the program about sensor fusion, and that's, I think, an area that's that's going to be, in particular, very, very interesting, because every single method of biometry has its strengths and it has its weaknesses. It has places where it works very well, it has places where it doesn't work as well. In fact, even on existing devices, you can improve the fingerprint sensor data with using the accelerometer and other devices or other things that are already integrated into that device. And so sensor fusion, you know, it's especially in industry, it's a little bit hard to think ahead to this because it's so challenging just to keep up with the putting, you know, existing biometry on phones. But you're starting to see phones coming out, like the HP Elite X3 is the first phone that'll ship with both iris and a fingerprint sensor later this year. So you're starting to see devices come with built-in support for two modalities. The question will be, how do we fuse these together? How do we look at the signals from these other devices? There's work going on in academia, there's work going on in industry in this area, but there's an important goal here. And it's not even about the method of the biometry, you know, whether it's a fingerprint or iris. In a way, it almost doesn't even matter. What's important here is what's the right level and the right authentication experience for what the user is trying to do. How can it be the least intrusive? Because remember, friction reduction has been one of the biggest drivers of this technology to date. So how do you make it the least restrictive that it can possibly be, while still providing the user with confidence that their identity, that their personal information is being protected? It's a very important psychological issue there. There may be times where you choose to go into an active authentication mode, even though the device is 99.9% confident that you are you. But it's to give you that sense of security, even if it isn't strictly needed. PayPal's a good example of this. You know, when you go to their website, you know, they have, you know, just because of the cookies and the other ways that they track users, they know when you type in PayPal to the website, to your web browser, they're 98% confident that they know who you are. But you still log in because that conveys something important about your identity and your information being protected. So there's an interesting balance and trade-off here that's just as important as which modality is the right modality. Your car may support iris scanning. Your car may know when you sit in the car that it's you versus when my wife sits in the car. It might know the difference, but there might still be a fingerprint sensor there for when I want to pay for a toll. Is it strictly required? No, but the action may be what's necessary of touching something, may be what's necessary in order to give people the confidence that everything's working the way it's supposed to work. And then there's one other really interesting opportunity and challenge here, which is how do we leverage all of these existing devices that we're carrying around with us? What is the natural way for our mobile phones to interact with all of these other devices that we have around us? So for instance, I'm carrying my mobile phone. When I go up to my car, do I want to unlock my car using my mobile device? How do I bless a new device, if you will? Let's say I'm renting a car and it has a fingerprint sensor built into it. Well, how do I go up to it and enroll? I don't want to touch the fingerprint sensor 10 times in the car to enroll, and I don't want to leave my data behind on that car. So how we use these existing devices to bless other devices, either in perpetuity or for a period of time, is going to be a very interesting challenge. Because again, it gets back to questions of liability, personal privacy. Am I putting my biometric template on this rental car? If I am, how do I have confidence it's actually going to disappear when that rental period ends? These are all solvable problems, but how you solve them and how you go through the user acceptance of these technologies is a really tricky thing. Again, part of how these devices have gotten accepted is with a core promise that your biometrics never leave the device. But there's a tension here that we're going to hit, where as these devices become more pervasive, it actually becomes a little bit annoying to enroll your biometrics in all these devices. In fact, I'm not a good example of this. I've got too many devices with biometrics. I probably have 4 devices with me at any time that all have fingerprint sensors. But what I've discovered is the more devices I have, the fewer fingers I've enrolled. Because it's just, even that little bit of work is annoying to have to repeat it over and over and over again. With some of my devices, I need to blow them away and reinstall them. It's just part of the hygiene in keeping the device fresh and fast. But I don't want to do it because that means I have to re-enroll my biometric templates. So these are challenges as we go from, first wave of devices, first era devices into second and third eras, when we've got more and more biometrics around us. How do we federate our enrollment? How do we share this data across all the ranges of devices that we're going to have? And these are some of the challenges and the opportunities that we see ahead. So as much as you're looking at different parts of the technical aspects of biometry, some of these, I'll call them ecosystem issues, are just as important. Fingerprint sensors had to get to a certain maturity level and a certain accuracy and quality level in order to get to scale. But we're not going to get to the end of era 2, and we're not going to get into era 3 if we don't come up with good answers for these kinds of problems. Answers that can be accepted, answers that respect privacy laws in different countries, answers that respect how people want to be in control of their personal information, which is inherently what biometrics are. It is your personal information, and then whatever else you've linked to it, your identity, your ID card. I think most of us see a future where our phones are really our wallets. We're not carrying around passports or ID cards or credit cards. But we're not there yet. But we're getting there. I know that this particular case that I have, where I have to keep a couple of credit cards with me because the payment service isn't accepted everywhere in the world, I'm not going to have to carry these for much longer. But there's a lot of work to be done to get there, and I've outlined a little bit of it here today. And I'd be happy to take questions in a bit about any aspect of this and some more. So to come back to this notion of 3 eras, the first era being really what we're at the tail end of now, which is the first mass adoption of consumer biometrics, which is amazing in and of itself. You look at the companies that have been in this space that have been very successful, or look at companies that have chosen not to adopt it. For example, it's almost impossible now to launch an Android device without a fingerprint sensor, at least a high-end or mid-tier device without a fingerprint sensor. You can't do a payment service now without some support for biometry. Apple even announced the inclusion of into their laptop platform, the ability to do Touch ID authentication for purchase online, so that your PC now will talk to your mobile device to complete transactions. So we're getting into some very interesting innovation here just as part of this first era. But there's a lot of work to be done on the second and third so that these devices really can be all the things we know they can be. They can be our wallets, they can be our identity. And if we lose it, it's revocable, it's safe. We don't worry about the device actually being lost, because even though it has a lot of sensitive information, we know we can still reach out. It's protected, and if we can access it on the network, we can shut it down and revoke the credentials. So we're really at the beginning of this. We're really even though we're at the end of this first era, there's such interesting technical problems ahead to be solved. But we know we'll solve them. We can see that future that's ahead of us, and it's a really compelling future. Sometimes it's a little bit scary. I read science fiction books about, walking down the street and my eye gets scanned and all the advertising I see is customized for me. I don't really like that aspect of the biometric future that we're heading into. But in terms of personal convenience, ease of use, kind of seamlessly moving through this digital life that we're increasingly involved in, biometry has a very central role to play in simplifying these experiences, in making it easy to do the things that we want to do, to have confidence that we are who we say we are, to drive efficiencies in economies, in consumer experiences to driving revenue for different companies, and even one of the things I can't wait to do is voting online, where I don't have to go to a voting booth somewhere. There's a whole realm of things in phase 2 that once we have this high trust scenario settled, a whole bunch of really valuable use cases that will open up, a bunch of value drivers that will make these devices, as indispensable as they are today, that much more. And then we take that innovation and that capability and we expand it out into IoT, into home, into automotive, into all of the different places that we routinely have to deal with access control or permissioning or making decisions, guaranteeing that we are who we say we are as we go about and we do different things in our life. So it's a pretty exciting time, and I'm really, I can't say that, I can't express more excitement over this era and what we're doing today, and the role that we play on the commercial side and what you do on the academic side. It's so important for driving forward and realizing this vision. And at the end of the day, there's really a couple of simple building blocks here. It's transitioning through these different eras. It's these higher trust use cases. They have to be enabled to begin with. We're not there yet. It's integrating with those modern identity infrastructure and back-end systems. And then it's also the sensor fusion, and that's going to be a really interesting, it's going to be an interesting set of design challenges and opportunities there. And in all of this, there's an enormous amount of innovation. So I don't know how popular it is to go create companies out of your time here at this university, but certainly in the Bay Area, it's a time-honored tradition. Go spend hopefully a full tour at the university. Unfortunately, many people leave a little bit early, but there's an enormous amount of innovation to be had. Fingerprint biometry, iris biometry, a lot of these technologies have been around for a while. But I hope that in this presentation today, you're seeing that there are a lot of related and adjacent pieces of infrastructure and technology that are needed to drive this vision and this whole ecosystem forward. So there's an enormous amount of opportunity. Yes, pure science, innovation at the biometry level, liveness detection, there's all sorts of interesting things, sensor fusion. But there's an enormous number of other business opportunities and areas where innovation and fresh thinking is required. And I look forward to talking with all of you more about that in the future. And hopefully we can collaborate on some of those things. Great. I'm finishing a little bit early, but I have 10 minutes or so for questions, I believe. Yep.
I have one initial question about the wallet applications that you have touched upon. And we are actually using our wallets less than 10 times, let's say 4 or 5 times a day. Maybe I'm sort of in comparison with unlocking,
Yes.
how would that make the case of being a ubiquitous and needed application? If that has to be, let's say that the high trust use cases have been solved, would it be worth? Would it still be necessary to take 10 plastic cards with you and plus some metals and paper support? I'm excited about the idea of seeing the coins dropping all the time from my old wallet.
Yes, well, and obviously, I believe pretty strongly in the future It's kind of an interesting place because I think there's actually a role to play for biometry on these pieces of plastic, which I didn't spend a lot of time talking about today. But first and foremost, you talked about the number of times that you pull out your wallet, and the point that you were making was how many times do you actually perform a financial transaction each day versus unlocking your device to check the time or to check your email. And the answer is a lot fewer times than doing email or just unlocking your device. But there are a couple of drivers there, and I was debating whether to show this slide or not, but I'll go ahead and show it. There's several benefits. So first of all, for all of us as consumers, we don't have to carry around as many pieces of plastic with us, right? So that's a big plus. And in fact, I got rid of carrying around a wallet. I literally do not carry a wallet. I've got my driver's license and 2 credit cards in the back of my phone case. And that's more than enough for most of what I need on a regular basis. So there is a benefit to just the physical benefit to not carrying around the plastic. But this diagram, which is slightly different than the unlock use case, this is actually a different cut into the trade-offs, but from a relying party or a bank's perspective, right? So from a bank's perspective, your bank actually has different motivations than we do. Their goal is to drive revenue. And so reducing the amount of time that it takes for you to perform a transaction is a significant benefit to them. Retailers, so I could do a similar diagram for retailers. So EMV transactions take quite a bit longer than tap and pay transactions that are facilitated by mobile devices. And I see this, it's relatively new in the US, but it's not uncommon where I'm standing, in Europe in a line and everyone's sticking in their EMV cards and you wait and you wait and you wait and a minute later it says, okay, you're good to go. That's a long time, relatively speaking. And some retail stores have actually calculated how much does that cost them if they could cut those transaction times in half. What would it do in terms of customer throughput? So there's a lot of motivation to solve this problem. So I think it will happen over time. And whether that's solved in our mobile devices or with cards with biometry, there's some significant drivers there for it. And by the way, also too, fraud is a driver there, but it's less significant than you might think.
It seems to me that two of the bigger barriers to user adoption of biometrics and their integration into back-end applications are areas you didn't talk about, but we have a little time.
We do.
Identity proofing and account management. Where do you see that advancing in this way?
That's a great question. So let's go back up to the slide. So, in fact, actually, before I leave this one, this is a view from the perspective of a company that wants to utilize biometrics. And notice that convenience means something different here, and it goes straight to what you were just speaking to, and that's the integration complexity and speed, right? So the harder or easier it is to use a method of biometry, that'll have a direct impact on how rapidly systems get adopted. A good example of this, and it's directly related to your question, is the difference in adoption between Touch ID and kind of the most well-known biometric standard outside of Touch ID, which would be those coming from the FIDO Alliance. And the FIDO Alliance specifications, which are fantastic, I actually spent an enormous amount of my life, over 4 years, working on those. They're fantastic, they're highly secure, they're great, but they have high adoption friction on the back end, whereas Touch ID is very fast and easy to integrate on the front end at an app developer level. So if you just do a quick count, FIDO's actually been around as long as or longer than Touch ID. How many apps are using Touch ID? It's a fair number of apps. How many are using FIDO? Very small number of applications out there, very small number of relying parties. So it goes straight to the question that you raised about the future of this, which is the back-end systems, user management, identity proofing. And here the bottom line, I think, really has to do with to what extent does identity federation take hold? I think there's a natural opportunity for you to, if you wish to go through a, kind of an identity proofing interaction with your bank or with your mobile carrier or some other entity where you had to show identity, your proof of legal identity when you established the account. The question, an interesting one, is to what extent will those identity assertions be trusted between companies? And to what extent do people even want their identity to be transferred between companies? So some very tricky policy questions. The technology is there, frankly, to do all the federation we need, to do the identity proofing and then to take the next steps. I think the question is really one of user comfort, adoption, policy, and risk. I think risk is one of the, it's not something that gets talked about an awful lot, but risk and how much you can actually trust the representation from, I'll just use, from if I authenticate into company A and your company B, if you rely upon the authentication event that's coming from company A, what risk does that expose company A to if there's some sort of fraud that goes on? So there's, in many ways, I think there's almost a need to have a regulatory framework around some of these biometric issues. One article that I read a while ago talked about how Visa and MasterCard are less of a kind of a settlement engine, if you will, and a financial engine, as what their real claim to fame is in managing risk and arbitrating risk across their ecosystems. And that's one of the things that's missing here on the biometry side. It's very user device centric, but if we really want to get the same kind of exponential curve that we see for, let's say, credit card adoption, we're probably going to have to structurally address risk and the risk of trusting different identity assertions from different institutions.
Regarding different use cases, could you say anything about where the biometric data would be stored? The device or not, it's probably on the device. But for banking application, I can imagine that it could be a central database.
Could be, and different banks and in different regions of the world have very different answers to this question. You have some legacy, I'll call them legacy regions, where biometrics were collected by the banks historically for some period of time. So there it's very natural for them to do server-side biometrics. But generally speaking, so far people have been, have had the highest comfort level with biometry being on their devices, your biometric data staying on your device and not going up into the cloud, even in a template form, not going up into the cloud. This is one of the interesting unresolved questions, and I think we're on a collision course here, where as we bought a single device for our own use, a phone that had a fingerprint sensor, it was great. Okay, great. My biometry never leaves the device. But when I have a second, a third, a fourth, the pain that I'm personally experiencing, or when my car has biometry in it, what do you do with it at that point? How do you get all of this information, all this biometry synchronized? Especially since we don't use some of these devices with the same frequency level. I get in my car probably every other day. The fingerprint data on my phone is quite a bit more accurate and up to date than what's in the car. So ideally, I would have some trusted mechanism to update that information that's in my car, so that it's always got the latest and greatest. So we're on a collision course, I think, between convenience and perceptions of security. There are secure ways of addressing this, but there's some communication and some kind of education with consumers that we'll have to go through.
About this issue.
So your question is about the actual security of the...
My fingerprint, for instance, which is very doable. We had this article last year about how someone just saw some high-definition pictures of the German defense minister and recreated a fingerprint.
Yeah.
So
Mm-hmm.
and I don't see anything in any of the solutions you spoke about which actually accounts for this possibility.
Sure. Did you have a second question, or do you want to do them one at a time?
So I do have a second question, but it's unrelated.
Okay. Well, so. Oh, that's fine. So you're right. I didn't speak to fundamental security of the method of biometry. In a way, indirectly, kind of a little bit indirectly, I did here, very indirectly. But in order to really answer your question, I've got to tell you a little story, and it's about my own background. So before I started working in the mobile space, before I started working in the biometric space, I spent many, many years working in the cryptography and security space. I worked at PGP Corporation and then Symantec. And so I began my own journey in mobile devices and biometry with a very, very strong sense of security. What is, how do you secure things? What's the proper way to secure things? And it was just a very, almost a religious orthodoxy, given my particular background. And if any of you know those other companies, either of those two companies, you would understand part of why I had that background. The single biggest thing that surprised me, and it took quite some time to really have this knowledge kind of beaten into my head, was, generally speaking, the security is not the most important aspect here. Which may seem strange because, yes, there are these high-profile cases. You've got rubber finger attacks of a different type, lifting fingerprints off of a device. And, is the industry working on those things? Sure. Fingerprint cards, we've got a liveness detection algorithm. You look at things like sensor fusion, and that will help quite a bit. Sure, great. It's one thing if the fingerprint sensor is saying that there's a good touch, but if the accelerometer says it's face down on the desk, there's a problem, right? So there has been, will be, and will continue to be innovation around making these systems more secure and more robust. But fundamentally, you have to keep in mind that beyond device unlock, that identity stack, there are risk engines on the back end that look at many other data points. It's not just the biometric data that you have, or the yes/no that comes off of the fingerprint sensor. There are many other factors that are looked at when you're going to do something with the device. Yes, unlocking the device and getting access to personal information is an issue, but from a security perspective, from an industry perspective, and I don't mean as a fingerprint sensor manufacturer, I mean as the users, the banks, the financial systems, the benefit that they get with biometry is not, can you defeat every single type of attack? It's, do you break scalable attacks? Do you make it much harder, if not impossible, to create a virus that can get loaded onto 1 million Android devices and scarf all the fingerprint data, the templates, or scarf personal information and credit cards? And the answer is yes, you do get that with biometry. Even in these rare cases where someone grabs a fingerprint image, you can revoke the device. I think we have to do more on revocability, deactivation of devices remotely. That's not just a biometrics issue, that's a PIN issue, that's a integrity of the operating system. There are cryptographic issues that go into that as well. But it's really been surprising to me how the defense against scalable attacks is by and far the most important thing about these biometric capabilities. And can you hack a phone with a rubber finger? Sure, but that's not scalable. You're just not, so far, you haven't seen that happen where, organized crime is, getting millions of phones and running them through and making rubber fingers. The cost-benefit return is just not there. So, a bit of a long-winded answer, but it's almost a counterintuitive answer in some ways, so I wanted to walk through it in more detail.
Okay, so as a follow-up, how long do you think it's going to be before that situation changes? Because we're really speaking of the economic viability of attacks of this kind. It doesn't currently exist because the infrastructure is in place,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not worth the industry's time.
Mm-hmm.
But that's going to change.
Mhm.
So in that case, in the not too distant future, it becomes worthwhile for somebody to spend their lifetime trying to figure out how to create double fingerprints because they need to find one person who they can loop, right? So,
Yeah, I guess I just don't, I'm happy to make a bet on whether that's actually going to be a prevalent form of fraud. You know, I mean, like most people, you know, hackers, identity thieves, they're very motivated by easy, big, fat, juicy targets. Individual phones, you know, the stealing an individual phone, you know, if you're able to lift a fingerprint off the phone, you know, algorithms will improve, you know, to mitigate against lifting a, you know, a fingerprint off the glass. But I just don't see that being a scalable attack, with the exception of, well, and it's not scalable at all. And if you go to the extreme end, like the defense minister, or, you know, I use the president of the United States as an example. If you stole his phone, a nation state is going to be able to break that phone no matter what. You know, so it doesn't matter whether it's a fingerprint. I mean, there's some great discussions of this in recent news in the United States about the FBI breaking into phones with fingerprint sensors into iPhones. So I think if you're a very, very very wealthy or a high-end individual, government, industry, whatnot, and your phone is stolen and it falls into, you know, an industrial spy's hand, that's a different matter than protecting the vast bulk of consumers out there, which is where most of the fraud occurs today. So I just don't see it happening at scale.
the point was the German minister's phone wasn't stolen.
Mm-hmm.
The print was made from a photograph.
Yes.
So, you know, it still leaves the option open that if the technology gets there, which it will, you
Mm-hmm.
will be recreating vast numbers of fingerprints from publicly available data,
Mm-hmm.
and they're linked to identity.
Yes, it can, but then you start looking at other technologies on the device. So, you know, this is, to be very clear, there will be an arms race, right? You know, what are the defeat mechanisms and what are the defenses against them? I'm not at all trying to say that there won't be, you know, a back and forth and back and forth. You know, biometric companies come up with new algorithms. You know, we put EKG sensors in the fingerprint sensor so that we can detect things. There's all sorts of hardware level innovation, but that's an arms race, right? And that's an arms race that has its own natural progression, and I've seen that play out in the past. There'll always be some way to break it, either now or in the future, right? So I think it would be unwise for us to say, will there be scenarios where you can never break into the device? No, there always will be scenarios, now or in the future. The question is, how scalable is it? How much effort do you have to put into it? You know, even if you've got this defense minister's fingerprint, now you have to go get his phone in order to actually use that data. So, you know, it's about rising the tide of security across the entire industry, knowing that if you really want to break into Dave's phone, and you get his phone and you get his copy of his fingerprint, you're going to be able to do it.
I would like to add one piece of arms to this type of breaking in and defense mechanisms that we are talking about. The issue of violence has been touched, but it is the equally valid argument important arm is in the trade.
Yes,
together and
it
make
is.
the arms race against the unscrupulous bad intentions, etc., work successfully. The victory, I hope, will be on our side. And with that, let me thank you, David.
Thank you.
And as a memory,
Oh, thank you so
you can
much.
take